Good.
Alrighty, so hello everyone. I am Wolf. I am the studio director of Watercress, and I've also been writing for Watercress for over 3 years. And joining me is Echofrost. He is our coding director and has been working with us for a little over 2 years, right?
Yep. A little over 2 years.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about visual novels in regards to how they fit into our modern world, where shorter burst media is the norm. In fact, Twitter and Facebook and anything like that, short media is the best way to go.
All right, cool. I'll talk for a little bit and I'll pass it back off to Tristan. And I apologize if I talk a little fast. There's a lot of information to cover. And I'll check the Discord just occasionally. You can tell me to slow down. All right, so as social media and instant messaging services take over communication, we're often told that this short bursting information harms our appetite for consuming slower media like books, right? So in this talk, we'll explore a little bit about how VNs fit into this world of 160 characters or less, and how the uprise of this digital communication affects aspects of visual novel development. And we'll talk a little bit about how visual novels could help bridge this gap between instant gratification and longer, more descriptive narratives. All right, so I want to start off by giving you a little bit of background and defining some language. What does 160 characters or less even mean? I think it's important to have a little bit of technical background on this topic. So when I say 160 characters or less, it's specifically a reference to the 160 character limit of SMS, or short message service, right? Which was established in the early 1980s. And when news outlets report on this early SMS concept, right, they often reference the Friedhelm Hillebrand story, which describes the chairman of the Global System for Mobile Communications, or GSM, deciding on a character limit for SMS. The story describes Friedhelm grabbing his trusty typewriter, typing out a variety of sentences and questions, and determining the average number of characters that were used for each sentence. Friedhelm determined through this method of testing that the majority of sentences fell just under 160 characters, making it a sufficient limit. Although understandably unconvinced by his research, GSM suggested doubling this limit. And so Friedhelm performed further research by analyzing a collection of postcards he had received, and after deeming that they all fell under 150 characters, the committee was magically convinced. Now, while some of these observations to this fun tale are true, the technical explanation is a little bit less exciting. The idea for SMS was to use existing telephone-optimized architecture to transport messages at a minimal cost. However, existing hardware limited the length of these messages to 128 bytes, which, after a bit of tweaking, was later improved to 167-bit characters. Now, although this isn't the earliest example, it gives us a good understanding of how early technology had a very strong influence on how we consume modern media. You're likely familiar with more modern limits akin to SMS, such as the 140 character or now 280 character limit of Twitter. And that raises a few questions. How have these character limits affected our consumption of media? People often tell us that the internet has destroyed people's patience, and that long thought-out writing and discussions are a fragment of the past. In fact, when asked about it, Dr. Deborah Thorne, professor of sociology at the University of Idaho, suggested that we just toss all of our electronics devices aside for several hours a day to help discourage the use of these shorter messages. We're hit every day with a waterfall of tweets, text messages, and status updates. And why would we even care about lengthier media if we know that a message can be communicated in just 160 characters? In fact, some people believe that this torrent of short-form thinking acts as a catalyst for longer meditation. When something exciting happens today, you're hit with a sudden storm of instant messages and status updates. This happens all the time for a variety of news stories, right? Technology releases, sports team updates, or even Donald Trump saying something goofy. You name it. You get hit with dozens of short takes on an event that give you a quick and succinct impression. This allows you, the reader, time to dwell on the variety of views and begin constructing your own opinion. So how does this compare to more traditional or longer media? Longer takes on the news examples that I just gave typically contain deeply considered and well thought out analysis. This is great because these longer takes can give you a stronger and deeper understanding of an issue. One of the bigger differences, though, is the life of media. Tweets, for example, are great for reaching a large audience for very quickly, but their lifespan is very short. It's unlikely for someone to remember a tweet that you wrote a month ago. And longer media can vary. Traditionally, if a book couldn't find an initial audience, it would get tucked away, hidden in a library, unlikely to ever be seen again. However, longer media now thrives much better on the internet. The availability and life of longer media has increased because it's much more likely for someone to stumble upon a longer media that's available on the internet than traditional forms, right? So I imagine you're already starting to see how VNs can play into these changing consumption patterns. It's easy to see VNs as a kind of bridge between these different forms of consumption. Typically, VNs feature a well thought out narrative. They're a device for telling a story, and it's their presentation that gives them such a modern advantage over traditional print, such as books. VNs break up the flow of this lengthy text into short segments that are presented briefly at a time. In fact, we wanted to look to see just how short these segments are. So I spent a little bit of time writing up a program that could analyze Ren Py scripts to determine an average character count of the text being displayed at any given time. Now, as you can see, our data sample was very lengthy in nature with the 3 examples that I've got on screen. It wasn't really, that was a joke. But this gives us a good idea of some of our development patterns. So we looked specifically at 2 watercress VNs, Palinurus, which was our very first NaNoWriMo entry, and My Girlfriend is a Demon Summoned from the Depths of Hell, which was our most recent Monster Jam entry. And we looked at the average character count of the text that was being displayed at any given time, which for each respectively was 66 and 67 characters. And that blew me away. It felt like such a short character count. It felt like such little information was being displayed at a time. So I went just a little bit deeper and I got my hand on some of the script files for Doki Doki. And this wasn't all the script. This was, as you can see, we only analyzed about 6,300 lines. But the average character count for text being displayed at any given time for Doki Doki was 41 characters, which was very interesting. And this prompted just a little bit more testing. This testing was very vague in nature. We wanted to see just how Ren Py kind of pushes developers in a specific direction with how many characters are being displayed at any given time. So, and there's a lot of variables involved with this. So just take this at face value, right? There's a lot of other testing that could go into this, but we just created the sample Ren Py projects for each of the 3 supported resolutions, right? And we looked at how many characters we could fit on a screen at a time. So for 1066 by 600, it appears you could fit about 247 characters at any given time before clipping into the quick menu. For 1280 by 720, it looks like you can display up to 342 characters at a time. Well, that's not recommended because it's pretty cluttered and visibly jarring. And then oddly enough, moving up to 1920 by 1080, we could display 273 characters before clipping into the main menu. So looking at that, we're looking at these base Ren Py projects, right? We're seeing that we can fit about an average of 287 characters on the screen at any given time without making any major modifications. And this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, right, we just looked at the average character count that we were utilizing in some of our VNs, and it was significantly smaller than what we're allowed to use, right? And I think it's also interesting that it's very close to the character limit of other media platforms like Twitter. All right, I'm going to hand it off to Wolf, who's going to talk a little bit more about the features developers can utilize to manage the information flow of visual novels.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about accessibility, how it impacts your plot, and the difference between a reader and a player, and how the limits impact that as well. So firstly, I'm going to talk about the metaphorical aspects of the limitation and how you should abuse it. The Ren Py dialog box limits you in the amount of characters you can use, as you've seen in the previous slides, but you can get around this with font choices, typesetting choices, and the resolution of your game. And this calls into question the accessibility of your game. And this is more GUI stuff. So not everyone in the world has 20/20 vision or can see in the first place, or are as healthy as everyone else in terms of the VN dev community. So what you should try to go for is going under the text limit and try to make sure that your text is as readable as possible. You want to make sure that the resolution is set in such a way that the text is readable, and you want to use sans serif fonts, which mean they don't have the extra bits and pieces. They aren't fancy. And if you could avoid those, good, especially because that messes the people who have dyslexia, and you want to try to find typefaces that are good for dyslexic community members. And also, don't forget to use the options Ren Py has available for you. We all know the italics, underline, bold, strike through, but you could also mess with the colors of the text and white outlines or black outlines at the back of the text to make it more visible compared to the background of the game or the dialog box itself. So make sure you're watching out for who's even playing your game and if your game is a good experience for them. Next, I'm talking about plot. You can use the dialog box to specifically control your pacing. If you have smaller bits of text, they're going to be clicking through it faster, and you could have a faster paced scene using smaller amounts of text. And you can do the opposite, where you clutter the text box to display the confusing aspect of a scene, or you can make it completely barren to really get the point across. Like even using 1, 2, or 3 words in a single text box can really bring a point home. And there's another part of Ren Py that I haven't talked about yet, and that's NVL. In NVL, you should definitely be careful with using. A lot of people will just use NVL when you're too lazy to use the dialog box or you're not worrying about the limitations. You should primarily use NVL for places that normal scripting wouldn't really allow for. If the scene just doesn't work in the normal dialog box, try to use NVL. And the next thing I'm going to talk about is the reader versus the player. The game itself is, visual novels are primarily dialogue. Narrative is important, but this is more like a script. Because you have backgrounds in music and sound effects and the GUI and everything else to help support your game, you don't want to just describe the backgrounds in the text box. You want to use it primarily for highlighting the backgrounds or putting your point across or using dialogue, because dialogue is king in visual novels. A lot of people just write a script and then slap that shit to the coder or the artist and have them design it and create it, and that doesn't work. If you have good communication with your team, you can make a really good inclusive experience. The 2 big examples being Nier Automata and Persona. Persona did a really, really good job of using the visual novel-esque text boxes and keeping it short. And Nier did a really good job of the user interface. The user interface fits perfectly in the universe. And that's really what all I have to say about the writing aspect of this.
So I'm going to tie it back with a few other questions that came up when we were talking about this, right? Will these new reading habits change VN development anyway? And in short, I don't really think so. I did some brief research yesterday looking at older visual novels. Oddly enough, the first result that came up was a VN called Policewoman Dog Gangbang Training, which people claimed was the very first visual novel. I'm 90% certain that isn't correct, but I'll leave that research up to you guys. But looking at a variety of older novels that I could find on Lemasoft and other sources, their development patterns were very similar to what we practice today. And obviously, VNs are the product of technological evolution, and I think it's safe to say that they have naturally evolved with our changing appetite for shorter bursts of information. As is evident in the preliminary research that we presented on the average character count that was being displayed in our games and how Ren Py encourages a limited number of characters to be displayed at any given time. So looking at these modern developmental practices, I think it's pretty safe to say that we're all doing pretty well as developers. Now, that doesn't keep the worry out that people won't make it all the way through a visual novel, that we won't be able to keep a user's attention. Again, VNs are an excellent media form due to their ability to bridge that gap between longer narratives and bursty presentation. So we should take full advantage of that. Take advantage of the limited character count that you can display on a screen, and take advantage of other elements that can keep a user's attention, right? It's clear that short bursting text helps keep a reader's attention, but there are also a variety of other features in visual novels that keep the reader hooked. Examples of this could be changing sprites, animations, interesting backgrounds, music, microgames, you name it. VNs use all these different arts to keep users engaged in a story. So we should take full advantage of all these to give people nibbles of information at a time, to keep them coming back. I think it's fair to consider VNs as just like a giant bait into a large meal at the end of their playthrough, where the real processing of information begins. We just hit users with a torrent of small bursty information until next thing they know, they're all the way through a story, and they can digest that at the end, right? So although the information we presented today wasn't very definitive, that it wasn't very telling, right? Our research was very limited in scope, but I hope it offers a chance for developers to take a step back and look at the developmental processes to see how they're keeping users engaged, and maybe reconsider how they're keeping users' attention. Yeah, I think that's all. Do you have any closing statements, Tristan?
Only that I want to thank Agi for setting this up, and thank everyone in the audience, and then thank Nye for having everyone take shots.
I'm drinking. Missing? Are we? What I have to mention? Lemonade.
I have to go on.
You guys have any questions? Is there a way to have the character counter program for Ren Py used? Yeah, I'll put the code up on GitHub and I'll link it in this chat, like right after this, honestly. It's a C# program written in Visual Studio. It's not very good, if I'm being honest. But hopefully someone can adapt it that wants to spend time on it to something really special, and I might continue supporting it to try to make it a more useful tool for development. Favorite Initial D song? Deja Vu. Easy. Next question.
A good one.
There's one about accessibility.
Do you have an answer to that accessibility one, Tristan?
Where is it?
Speaking of accessibility, do most NEVNs work with screen readers for the visually impaired?
That is an excellent question. I don't know enough about that in particular. Watercress does have some visually impaired people who we work with, people who are like legally blind. But we haven't ever worked with someone who really needs screen readers. So that's really something you should talk to someone who is more in tune with that aspect.
Yeah, Ren Py mentions if you hit V, it has a self-voicing mode, which will help. But yeah, a lot of the Japanese engines won't have anything for that, as far as I can tell. So.
Also, voice acting is really good. Like, voice acting is good because voice acting, but it's also reads stuff to people who are impaired.
Yep.